You know, the American people love a fair fight, and so do I, especially where the issues of the day are being debated. In a free market, though, fairness should always be determined based upon equality of opportunity, not equality of results. Everyone should, in effect, have a chance to make their case. That's why it's so disturbing to many of us that some of the leading voices in Congress over the last 2 years have been calling for Congress to enforce an idea of fairness on the airwaves of America in the form of restoring the so-called Fairness Doctrine. But our nation should always proceed with caution whenever some would achieve fairness by limiting the freedom of others. Now, the American people cherish their freedom. It is, in effect, a blood-bought right. There is totality of agreement on this floor about that. In fact, I believe that's why President Ronald Reagan repealed the so-called Fairness Doctrine after it had been in place for almost 4 decades back in 1987. The Fairness Doctrine actually regulated the content of radio for much of the last century and limited the ability of radio stations to deal with controversial issues without meeting a standard of equal time or balance or record keeping. As a result of that, as many of us old enough to remember will attest, talk radio as we know it today virtually did not exist before 1987. Well, with some of the talk of restoring the Fairness Doctrine to the law of the land, Congressman Greg Walden of Oregon and I have been working over the last 2 years to ensure broadcast freedom. We've authored the Broadcaster Freedom Act, which is co-sponsored by every Republican in the House of Representatives. And this week we'll bring to the floor a Broadcaster Freedom Amendment as a part of the Financial Service Appropriations Bill. Many may not know, who are looking in, Madam Speaker, that the Federal Communications Commission receives its entire budget through the Financial Services Appropriations Bill, and we believe this is an opportune time, as we were able to do 2 years ago, to use the power of this Congress and the people in this Congress on both sides of the aisle to advocate for the freedom of the airwaves of America by limiting the ability of the Federal Communications Commission to bring back the so-called Fairness Doctrine. But first, for the uninformed, the Fairness Doctrine is, in effect, something of an Orwellian and Depression-era Federal Communications Commission rule that was devised back in 1949. As I mentioned, it required radio broadcasters to present both sides of an opinion when discussing controversial topics. It put unelected bureaucrats at the FCC in charge of enforcement and determining what speech was legal. Because of the lack of clarity in the Commission's ruling, broadcasters, more often than not, opted to offer non-controversial program in lieu of hours of paperwork, countless legal fees, and a potential threat to their broadcast license. Recognizing the chilling effect that the regulation was having on broadcast freedom, the FCC began actually to overturn its own ruling on the Fairness Doctrine in 1985. Following that change in policy, President Reagan's veto of attempts to reinstate it, the results have been dramatic. And think about it. Before the Fairness Doctrine was repealed, there were some 125 talk radio stations in America. Now there are more than 2,000. And while names like Limbaugh and Hannity and Laura Ingraham and other conservative giants are better known to many, the truth is that when you look at the totality of the talk radio marketplace, from the local level to the regional level to the national level, there's an extraordinary diversity of opinion. Many progressive, moderate, and liberal programs succeed extraordinarily well at the local level in many markets around the country. Unfortunately, in spite of this recent history and the breakout of broadcast freedom since 1987, there's been talk in the last several years about the need to level the playing field of radio broadcasting by restoring the Fairness Doctrine. Let me say from my heart, I believe it is dangerous to suggest that a government bureaucracy would be a competent arbiter of free speech. As a former radio talk show host myself, I know personally what the Fairness Doctrine meant to radio back in the day, and I know that it would ultimately muzzle what is the dynamic public discussion that we call talk radio in America today. But let me be clear on this. I believe that the Broadcaster Freedom Amendment that we'll bring this week, giving members of this body an opportunity to say no to the Fairness Doctrine and to say no to a new iteration of it that takes the form of regulations under the rubric of localism, I believe that that would be met by broad and bipartisan support. If memory serves, 2 years ago, when I brought the Pence Amendment banning the Fairness Doctrine from being implemented by the FCC, more than 305 members of Congress voted for it, including 100 members of the Democrat majority. So I urge support for the Broadcaster Freedom Amendment. Join us in embracing freedom on the airwaves of America. And I yield back the balance of my time.